Assalamu alaikum ji. History and systems of psychology. Hopefully you have gained some knowledge about the 19th and the 20th century psychologists. We were into the 18th lecture, and chronologically, historically, we had come up to the 20th century. And in that regard, we had shifted our attention from Europe and had come into the North American continent. For the next two more lectures, that is today's and the next lecture, we would be talking generally about psychological contributions from the North American continent. और नॉर्थ अमेरिकन कॉन्टिनेंट का मतलब है दो अहम मुल्क ज़्यादा, यूएसए, यूनाइटेड स्टेट्स ऑफ अमेरिका, और दूसरा कनाडा. For the time being, we will talk about the contribution of a very prominent North American psychologist. But before we go into discussing his contribution, let us review what we had done in the last lecture. Remember, we were talking about what? That's right, behaviorism. And we had talked about early behaviorists. मैंने आपसे ये भी गुजारिश की थी कि जिन लोगों का हमने जिक्र किया, they were categorized in this compartment of early behaviorism by later historians. They had not talked about their being behaviorists or early behaviorists. It is the later historians who had categorized them into this under the main heading of early behaviorists. And we had in that regard talked about three early behaviorists. Let us review those three early behaviorists before we touch on today's topic. We talked about 1. Albert Weiss, 2. Edwin Holt, and 3. Walter Hunter. All right, let us review what they had said. Weiss had said that psychology really is a study of, is a science of the organism, which is really a biological, physiological organism, and which is really also a social organism. In other words, if you look at the subject matter of psychology, which is human beings are biosocial beings. That biological, physiological factors make up what human beings are. Part of our behavior, part of our psychology is due to these physiological, biological factors. And the other part of our being, another part of our expression of psychology is what the social factors have made us to be. The social environment, the impact of other people, the presence of other people, the historical, cultural, religious forces that impinge, that act upon a human being are what mold him and therefore a human being is really a biosocial being. He also said that we should be looking at the behavior of this biosocial being rather than his consciousness. And who was more interested in consciousness? Of course, if you remember, the structuralists and the functionalists. And this is the break of those later psychologists from the earlier psychologists. Earlier psychologists, Wundt and William James, had defined psychology as a science of consciousness, whereas these gentlemen are talking about psychology as a science of behavior, and are proclaiming that we should really not look at consciousness. Because consciousness is something that we cannot study with tools, instruments, methodologies that are used in physical sciences. Therefore, if we have to make psychology a science, if psychology has to control and predict human behavior, then it must concern itself with concrete, observable behavior. Isliye, they are called behaviorists because they were interested in looking at, in studying behavior rather than consciousness. The other psychologist that we had noted in this regard was Hunter. And what did he say? Hunter had also partially rejected consciousness as a focus of study. He said psychologists must focus on what is directly observable. He is best known, if you remember, do you remember? By two things in experimental or general psychology. Number one, his experiments in maze learning, particularly temporal maze learning, and his experiments on reaction time. Since he was looking at human or organisms learning, and since he was looking at reaction time, because of his focus on learning and reaction time, both directly observable manifestations of behavior, therefore he is called today as a behaviorist and is included in the behaviorist school. And the other early behaviorist that we talked about was Holt. Do you remember his contribution? I'll give you a hint related to learning and related to childhood experiences. Okay? Let's refresh ourselves, our memories on that. Holt had said that learning is or takes place as a result of internal and external stimuli. When internal and external stimuli register on the organism, learning takes place. That was one of the contributions. Do you know what is an internal stimulus? Could you think of an example of an internal stimulus? Ji haan, sar dard could be an example of an internal stimulus. Bhook lagna could be an example of internal stimulus. Could you think of an example of an external stimulus? ये मेरी आवाज जो आप तक आ रही है, ये एक्सटर्नल स्टिमुलस है. जो आपको सर्दी या गर्मी का एहसास है, those are external stimuli. Now, what he is saying is, What Holt is saying is that we learn as a result of external and internal stimuli. What he is saying really is that learning is a function of stimulus and response. The other thing that Holt said was, or the concept that he gave was the concept of canalization. Do you remember what is canalization? Canalization is the impact of early childhood experiences on a person. He said a person's behavior is a result also of canalization, that is, the childhood experiences. क्या ऐसा है? जी हाँ, ऐसा ही है. आप मेरी जो जुबान सुन रहे हैं और इसको समझ रहे हैं, उर्दू और अंग्रेजी को आप जो समझ रहे हैं, वो इसलिए भी है कि आप ये पहले लर्न करके आए हैं इन योर चाइल्डहुड. जिस तरह से आप खड़े होते हैं, जिस तरह से आप अपने कपड़े पहनते हैं, जिस तरह से आप बैठ के खाना खाते हैं, जिस तरह से आप हाथ मिलाते हैं, जिस तरह से आप चलते हैं, जिस तरह से ख़वातीन दुपट्टा ओढ़ती हैं, जिस तरह से कंघी करती हैं, ये आपके चाइल्डहुड एक्सपीरियंसेस का हिस्सा रहे हैं. इसीलिए आपने इनको लर्न किया है और आपकी साइकोलॉजी का हिस्सा है ये चाइल्डहुड एक्सपीरियंसेस. तो हमारी लर्निंग और हमारी कैनलाइजेशन इज what causes behavior. And that is what Holt had said, that we should look at behavior, and behavior is a function of, is a result of learning, and is a function of or a result of canalization. And that is why we include him as one of the earlier behaviorists. चलिए, let us go forward from here and take a look at a very prominent person who was the person who started the school of behaviorism, who said who was a behaviorist, and who wrote books with the headings of behaviorism, who considered himself, who wanted to be called a behaviorist. And that was J.B. Watson. J.B. Watson was born in 1878 and he died in 1958. He began his studies at the University of Chicago and then he taught for a number of years at the Johns Hopkins University at Baltimore. By the way, एक छोटी सी tidbit मैं भी बता दूं. I had also the opportunity of studying at Baltimore and spending a lot of time in the city and at the university that we are talking about. Watson worked for a number of years at Johns Hopkins University. It's in the middle of the town. आपके जहन में तो शायद अमेरिकन यूनिवर्सिटीज़ का इस तरह का इमेज होगा कि बड़े बड़े उसके कैंपसेस हैं और खुली खुली जगह हैं. ज़्यादातर अमेरिकन यूनिवर्सिटीज़ ऐसी ही हैं, लेकिन जॉन्स हॉपकिंस यूनिवर्सिटी बाल्टीमोर शहर में है और ये सबर्ब का हिस्सा नहीं है. इसलिए इसमें वो खुलेपन का एहसास जो किसी दूसरी अमेरिकन यूनिवर्सिटी में है वो यहाँ इतना नहीं है. लेकिन नहायत मॉडर्न यूनिवर्सिटी है और वॉटसन को यहीं काम करने का इत्तेफाक हुआ. यहीं उसने अपनी एनिमल लेबॉरेटरी सेटअप की, यहीं से उसने किताबें लिखी, यहीं पर ही वो बिहेवियरिस्ट कहलाया और यहाँ से ही उसने काम ख़त्म करके देन ही जॉइंड द कॉर्पोरेट वर्ल्ड, joining an advertising company, becoming their psychologist and advising industrialists, marketers, and particularly advertisers on how to effectively use psychological principles for the purpose of advertising and for the purpose of marketing. तो वॉटसन की एक कंट्रीब्यूशन जहां बिहेवियरिज्म से मुतल्लिक भी है, उसकी कंट्रीब्यूशन ये भी है कि उसने बहुत से ऐसे प्रैक्टिकल तरीके बताए थे, मेथडोलॉजीज अडॉप्ट की थी, जिनके ज़रिए मार्केटिंग और पर्टिकुलरली एडवर्टाइजिंग में बहुत फ़ायदा पहुंचा था. वो कंपनी जो है वो अब तक कायम है जिसमें वॉटसन ने काम किया. और ये भी आपको बताता चलूं कि आपके मुल्क में भी वो कंपनी अब तक काम कर रही है. इट्स एन इंटरनेशनल, इट्स ए मल्टीनेशनल कंपनी एंड इट हैज़ ब्रांचेस इवन इन पाकिस्तान. चलिए अब इससे आगे चलते हैं और वॉटसन को और कुछ एक दो चीज़ें देखते हैं. वॉटसन रिजेक्टेड साइकोलॉजी being a study of consciousness. He vehemently criticized and rejected those people who called psychology a study of consciousness, because he thought consciousness cannot be observed directly, and something that cannot be observed directly with the use of methodologies and instruments that physical sciences use should not be considered a science. Therefore, he did not regard psychology as a science of consciousness, but he defined psychology as a science of, बताइए क्या कहा होगा उसने? That's right. He defined psychology as a science of behavior. और इसने स्ट्रॉन्ग अपील की थी और इसकी मैथडोलॉजीज इतनी स्ट्रॉन्ग रही हैं दैट ही वॉज इलेक्टेड टू बी द प्रेसिडेंट ऑफ द अमेरिकन साइकोलॉजिकल एसोसिएशन. अमेरिकन साइकोलॉजिकल एसोसिएशन और APA is a collection of professional psychologists who maintain an overall directional view of all activity that takes place on the American continent related to the activities of psychologists. He was elected to be the president of that association, so you can well imagine that his appeal had a great influence upon his colleagues at the American scene. In one of his books, one of his early books entitled Behavior, he defined psychology as a science of behavior and proposed that psychologists should study only behavior, and psychologists should not study something that cannot be directly observed, that is consciousness. अब अगर हमने कॉन्शियसनेस नहीं पढ़नी तो क्या देखना चाहिए हमें? Let us take a look at the definition and scope of how he defined psychology and what he considered was the scope of psychology. Definition तो मैंने आपसे भी गुजारिश की, that he defined psychology as a study of behavior. Notice two things in this definition. He is talking about psychology being a scientific study of behavior to the neglect of consciousness, number one. Number two, he is not defining what kind of behavior, whether human behavior or animal behavior. So you see, when he says that psychology is a science of behavior, he is also talking about the scope of psychology being expanded. We are talking about, therefore, human behavior as well as animal behavior. The स्कोप ऑफ साइकोलॉजी, अब आप पूछेंगे स्कोप क्या है, पहले आपको अंदाजा होगा, आप पढ़ के आए होंगे. स्कोप इज द फील्ड. साइकोलॉजी ने कौन कौन सी फील्ड में अपने मुताले को फैलाना है. आपको याद होगा जब हम वुंड और हम विलियम जेम्स की बात कर रहे थे, तो हम बात कर रहे थे psychology being a study of consciousness. Now, consciousness can not be assigned to animals. We can't say, as Wundt had said, that animals have consciousness and that their consciousness can be described in terms of structure of consciousness. By defining psychology as a science of behavior, Watson had expanded the scope of psychology, the field of psychology. और अगर आप थोड़ा सा पीछे जाके देखें तो आपको अंदाजा होगा कि ये ट्रेडिशन पैवलोव में भी थी. पैवलोव is the first person that had done experiments on animals whose results were then used to understand human behavior. The other important contributor, or in this regard, in the field of comparative psychology, was, remember, Thorndike, who did his experiments on cats. We will talk about other experimental psychologists also who used animals, but here we are talking about Watsonian behaviorism being defined as science of behavior, and science of behavior which encompasses, which is extended to human as well as animal behavior. इसलिए वॉटसन के नज़दीक psychology should study human behavior and psychology should also study animal behavior. Where would you now put Thorndike? Obviously, you would put Thorndike in the category of a behaviorist. All right? Let us go forward with Watson. Watson also said that we should not use introspection as a method of psychology. Introspection के ज़रिए उसका ये ख्याल था कि हमें ठीक पता नहीं चलता, हमें पता ही नहीं चलता कि बिहेवियर क्या है. That we should only use those data. मैंने those data क्यों कहा? Because data is plural. The singular for data is datum. Data is not singular, it is not it. Never confuse that. So those data that can be collected by experimentation and observation should form the basis, the ground for psychology in the view of Watson. We should be looking at behavior and we should be looking at objective methods or experimental methods to collect information, knowledge about behavior. He also said that the aim of the study of psychology should be to provide prediction and control of behavior. आपको याद है कि कुछ अर्सा पहले मैंने जब जिक्र किया था आपसे बिहेवियरिज्म से मुतल्लिक, तो मैंने कहा था that we will talk about Watson and his claim that if you let a person control the environment of a child, he could make the child into a thief or a king. And what is Watson saying here? He is saying the same thing. When he talks about the definition and scope of psychology, and he says that it should be to provide prediction and control of behavior. That is what he's aiming at, to be able to control the environment of a person and thereby exercise, ideally, total control over his behavior. This is an important, prominent point of Watsonian behaviorism. Watsonian behaviorism also involves study of psychology or study of behavior in terms of stimulus and response patterns. What does that mean? It means that Watson put forward the view that behavior is nothing but a response of the organism to a stimulus. The response that you see, that you observe, the behavior that you see, that you observe, is a direct dependent variable, direct effect, direct uska natija hai of what is acting upon the organism. What he is saying is that there is nothing mysterious about behavior. जैसा उसको स्टिमुलस मिलेगा, बिहेवियर ऑर्गेनिज्म वैसा ही बिहेव करेगा. इसमें कोई मिस्ट्री, कोई जादू की फोर्सेस, कोई हिडन फोर्सेस, कोई चाइल्डहुड एक्सपीरियंसेस, कोई मोटिव्स, कोई ऐसी चीजें शामिल नहीं हैं. यानी ये सीधी सीधी सी बात है दैट बिहेवियर इज ए स्टिमुलस रिस्पॉन्स कनेक्शन, ए स्टिमुलस रिस्पॉन्स रिएक्शन. इसको समझने के लिए हमें कोई ज्यादा गहरी मिस्टीरियस बात जानने की जरूरत नहीं है. It can be understood, by it I mean behavior can be understood in terms of stimulus and response patterns. अब और भी एक बात उसने कही, if somebody says that we should use observational, experimental methodologies to study behavior, then he is also implying that we should do away with introspection. Remember, Wundt and his pupil Titchener, Wundt had said that psychology is a study of consciousness, and that consciousness has a structure, and that structure can be discovered by introspection, by getting to know what a person is thinking or feeling, by making him describe what he is thinking and feeling. So introspection is really a way in Wundt's mind to know the structure of consciousness. And here is Watson rejecting introspection because he thought, or he is saying, that we simply should study what is directly observable, that is behavior, and when you are studying behavior, there is no need for you to go into finding out, to go into collecting introspective report or get the subject or the person to introspect. So introspection has no place in the psychology as defined by Watson. यहाँ एक प्रॉब्लम है. वो प्रॉब्लम वॉटसन को ये दिखाई दिया that sometimes introspection can give important clues. Sometimes introspection can give you important data. So he rejects introspection, and if he totally were to reject introspection, he would be denying himself that important data that comes from introspection. So how did Watson reconcile these two things? क्या ख्याल है? Well, he reconciled it by saying that we should not, that psychologists, that behaviorists, that experimental psychologists, that scientists should not collect data by introspection, but may collect data by what he called verbal report. He changed the term introspection to the term verbal report. But this is not a mere semantic change. ये लफ्ज़ों में सिर्फ चेंज नहीं हुई, बल्कि अहम बात यह है कि उसने वो इम्पोर्टेंस जो इंट्रोस्पेक्शन के साथ समझी जाती थी, उस इम्पोर्टेंस को उसने ख़त्म किया, लेकिन इंट्रोस्पेक्शन की इम्पोर्टेंस को टोटली रिजेक्ट भी नहीं किया. आपको ये कुछ दिख रहा है जो मैं आपको बताने की कोशिश कर रहा हूं. Apparently it seems that he rejected introspection. Well, he rejected introspection, but not in toto, not completely, because he talks of verbal report as a minor but important way of knowing about the experiment or collecting data about the subject matter of psychology. जब आप ऐसी वाया मीडिया तलाश करेंगे तो आपको एक और रास्ता भी दिखाई देगा, and that is, let me revert some years back and refresh your memory about René Descartes. What had René Descartes said and what was his main claim? चलिए मैं 3 तक गिनता हूं और आप याद कीजिए क्या था रेनी डिकार्टे का पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू. He said that we can doubt everything except one's doubt. Remember that? And he said, cogito ergo sum. Because I think, therefore I am. I think, therefore I am. That, which means that my thinking is beyond any shadow of doubt, which means that thinking is real, it exists. If thinking exists, can Watsonian behaviorism see thinking? That is the dilemma that Watson was faced with. If thinking exists, and René Descartes had shown beyond any shadow of doubt that I exist because I think. So thinking is a real thing. How does Watson reconcile this? Thinking is not directly observable. So Watson invented or coined a new term. And he said that thinking is nothing but implicit behavior. Implicit behavior means a behavior which is hidden, which cannot be directly seen. And thinking is a manipulation of images. जब इंसान सोचता है तो वो अपने ज़हन में, अपनी सोच में कुछ इमेजेस लाता है और वही इमेजेस की मैनिपुलेशन, उनकी रीअरेंजमेंट थिंकिंग है. इसलिए वॉटसन का ये ख्याल है दैट थिंकिंग इज इम्प्लिसिट बिहेवियर, एंड दैट इज हाउ वॉटसन reconciles to the concept of thinking also. Another important thing in Watsonian behaviorism is his concept of learning. Somebody who defines psychology as a science of behavior what do you think would be his theory or his point of view about human learning? His point of view about human learning would be the same as of anyone who saw learning taking place as a result of conditioning. Let us refresh ourselves on what conditioning is and how conditioning takes place and how learning takes place. Do you remember Ivan Pavlov? Do you remember his experiments with dogs? And do you remember that he gave us principles of conditioning or principles of learning? And those were, do you remember what those were? That dogs, organisms, learn as a result of 1. Reinforcement. That learning, if not reinforced, conditioning not reinforced, results in extinction. That when reinforcement is reintroduced, spontaneous recovery takes place. That if the organism does not distinguish between one stimulus and another stimulus, that is stimulus generalization, and that if the organism can distinguish between one stimulus and the other stimulus, that is discrimination. And Pavlov had said that these were the 5 basic principles of learning or principles of conditioning. Watson had said the same thing, that learning takes place as a function of conditioning, and that learning is dependent upon reinforcement, extinction, generalization, discrimination, and spontaneous recovery. The same principles that Pavlov had discovered that govern learning are said to be operative by Watson in learning. So his theory of learning or his point of view of learning is almost identical to Pavlovian point of view about learning. एक और बात जो वॉटसन ने कही है जिसकी तरफ मैं आपकी तवज्जो दिलाना चाहूँगा वो है the concepts of memory and images. एक और प्रॉब्लम अराइज जो होता है if you define psychology only as a science of behavior, then can you see memory? You can't see memory because memory is something that resides within the organism. And then, can you see images? Of course, you can't see images as they reside within the organism. They are not directly observable. But we know that memory exists. If I ask you, what did you do last Thursday? Or what did you do on last Eid? Where did you say your prayers 4 Eids ago? You wouldn't remember those. So, memory is real. And if I were to ask you, draw a picture of a house, I will ask you to sit in a room and close yourself with walls, you see nothing, but draw a picture. And you would be able to draw it. There is a memory, and you can translate that memory into an image. How does Watson reconcile that? How does Watson show that to be a behavioristic manifestation? Well, Watson said that memory and images are molecular behavior, small behavior of molecules that reside within the organism, that are part and parcel of the organism, but they cannot be directly observed with the crude instruments of observation. They are, because they are molecular, very, very small in nature. So that is how Watson reconciles memory and images. Now notice that he has reconciled many things. He has reconciled introspection. He has reconciled thinking. He has reconciled memory. He has reconciled images. All of these things that apparently belong in the realm of consciousness have been defined in behavioristic terms. And that is an important contribution that Watson has tried to make. एक और अहम बात जिसका मैंने अभी पहले भी जिक्र किया था आपसे, that was his environmentalism. और ये environmentalism क्या है? वॉटसोनियन सेंस में environmentalism का मतलब है that it is the environment that determines, that conditions a human being. And what is it a reflection of? Zara sochiye, we were talking about British philosopher psychologists, and in that context we had used a term, tabula rasa. Do you remember that term? Tabula rasa was used by John Locke, and tabula rasa means clean slate. John Locke had said that at the time of birth of a child, his mind is like a clean slate. And he had said that his experiences, his environments, write on that clean slate. That he becomes, Locke had said, whatever he is as a result of the environmental forces, the environmental environments impacting on his tabula rasa, writing on his clean slate. Now look at Watson. Watson's environmentalism is the same thing. He is saying that if you let me control the environment of a person, the environment of a child, I can make him a king or a thief. Isn't he reflecting what Locke had said? Isn't this a reflection of the Lockean tradition? That's what it is. That the environment, the kind of stimuli, forces that we get outside, around us, determine who we are and what we become. And that is an important concept of Watsonian behaviorism. As I said to you earlier, Watson remained at Johns Hopkins University at Baltimore, and then later on shifted from his academic career to a career in the corporate world and went into advertising and marketing and advising people on effective advertising and effective marketing. Before we close today, let us look at Watsonian behaviorism and what he talked about. One, we talked about his definition of psychology. That was, psychology is a science of behavior. Psychology is a science of behavior. Whose behavior? Human beings as well as animals. So we are talking about a larger scope of psychology. Psychology is to study both animals and human beings. Then he rejected introspection as a method of scientific study. He said we should be looking at only objective, verifiable facts. But in later writings, he says we might consider getting verbal reports, but that should not be the main data of psychology. The main data of psychology should come from objective scientific methods used for study. Then, of course, he went on to elaborate his theory of learning, and his theory of learning is the same as that of Pavlov, that is conditioning. We learn by conditioning, and conditioning is reinforcement, extinction, spontaneous recovery, generalization, discrimination. These are the 5 principles. So human beings learn, or animals or organisms learn by conditioning. He also said, Watson also said, that environment play a dominant role, a determining role in the psychology of a person, in the determination of a person's behavior. वो क्या बनेगा, वो कैसे बिहेव करेगा, वो कैसे खाए पिएगा, वो कैसे आगे बढ़ेगा, या डरेगा, या बहादुर बनेगा, या चोर होगा, या बादशाह बनेगा, वो जो भी बनेगा, that would be dependent upon what kind of environmental forces act upon him. He also said that thoughts are nothing but internal behavior, that we could define images, memories, and thoughts in terms of internal molecular behavior. In any case, whether it is a thought, or it is an image, or it is a piece of memory, it can be described as internal behavior. And our behavior is nothing but a stimulus and response connection. That there is nothing mysterious in terms of the stimulus and response, and therefore there is nothing mysterious in human or animal behavior also. Where have we arrived, therefore? We have arrived in defining psychology in terms of behavior. We have arrived as a result of looking at early behaviorists, starting with Thorndike, with Weiss, Holt, Hunter, and then with J.B. Watson, a group of distinguished researchers who saw that psychology can be defined, can be studied in objective, observable terms with objective, observable methodologies. We have seen that the scope of psychology has shifted from being a study of only human beings to becoming a study of animals also. Why do we want to study animals? After all, psychology should concern itself with human beings. So why study animals? Because animal behavior is a simple version of human behavior. Because by working, experimenting upon animals, we can understand their behavior and thereby shed light on human behavior. And that is why the scope of psychology has expanded. It has also included animals as the subject matter of psychology. Why was the need to study behavior and make it a scientific study? Because the Industrial Revolution had taken place, because the world was moving rapidly towards industrialization, and one of the requirements of industrialization was to be able to control and predict human behavior. And that is why we see these people focusing more and more on human behavior and more on objective, observable methods of studying human behavior. I hope you have been able to understand the basic tenets of behaviorism up to Watson. अगर आपका ये ख्याल है कि बिहेवियरिज्म यहाँ ख़त्म हुआ तो ऐसा नहीं है, क्योंकि हम इससे आगे भी बिहेवियरिज्म के बारे में जानेंगे और बहुत अहम बिहेवियरिस्ट्स के बारे में जानेंगे हम, who are called later behaviorists or who are called neo-behaviorists. N-E-O, not N-E-W, N-E-O. But that, until next time, जब तक के लिए रिवाइज करते रहिए, देखते रहिए, पढ़ते रहिए. Until the next time, खुदा हाफिज, God be with you.